My name is Manuel Jimenez, and we are at the Woodlake Botanical Gardens.
And my name is Olga Jimenez. Manuel and I have been married since 1970, so that makes it 52 years. And we have lived in this little community mostly our entire life.
Well, speaking of farm labor, my generation actually would start working at a very young age. By the time that children my age at 5 and 6 years old, there was a task that we could do to help our parents in the harvest of various crops. For example, in the citrus harvest, we would pick the bottoms of the trees because we're too young to move ladders, so they would call us ratas, or the rats. And we would pick the bottoms of the trees, and we had a special bag that was made for children to be able to do the harvest. And then the grapes, for example, not only did we pick at a young age, when our children were born and came of age, we also taught them to work in the fields, and they actually picked grapes with us. And the first jobs that they did at a young age was to put paper down and spread the grapes. And so they started at a very young age as well.
Being a female, I can remember that my duty was to take care of the little ones. And I can remember being in a station wagon with maybe 5 children, and I was the oldest. My job was to feed them, give them water, change their diaper, and I would get some cloth diapers and pretend they were curtains, and I would put them on the windows and close the window, and therefore we had shade. And I can remember that our toys was mostly cotton. We'd pull the cotton and play with it. And one time I thought, I'll make a little bridge. So I stuffed the cotton in a little hole and I lit it with a match. And boy, was I amazed how fast that fired. I mean, I never knew that something could burn that quick. So I was cautious about having matches around.
Wow.
And so I knew that my mom depended on me, and even though I was very young, I had a lot of responsibility to make sure that all the children were safe. I'm surprised that we made it through.
The one thing that changed in about 1955 is that my grandfather was involved in a local union, and they were organizers. They were organizing farm workers that worked for the Katie Martin Ranch had to ask for higher wages. And at that time, my grandfather and all his friends were laid off, fired, and so it became difficult to get work locally. So my grandfather decided that we should go north for the summer to pick crops in the San Jose area. And so we followed the crops going north. And from 1955 to 1965, our family would leave Woodlake in May. Therefore, we didn't finish school. And we would go to the Hollister area and pick early cherries. And then from there, we'd move a little bit northeast, right there in San Jose, and pick cherries there as well, followed by apricots and sometimes the pear harvest. After the pear harvest, then what we would do would leave to the Yuba City area, where we would pick peaches, cannery peaches. And of course, after the peaches, then we would head south back again to the Fresno area, where we would get involved in the grape harvest, and then continue the grape harvest. Actually, this was a raisin grape harvest, continue with rolling raisins, then finally returning back to school in the month of late September or early October.
My experience as a farm worker migrating started out in Texas. And I can remember being in a canvas type, long, big transporting truck. And there was families, and there would be like 4 or 5 families, and we each had a little corner to ourselves with mostly the clothes on our back, a washboard, a tub to wash clothes and bathe the children, and a metate, which is to make the corn tortillas. We did not grow up with the comforts of pillows and your own individual blankets and all that. It was called survival. And so therefore, everybody worked together, everybody played together, everybody ate together. There was no fighting. And it wasn't until I grew up that I realized how we must have been very poor, but at the time we did not realize that we were poor. We were fortunate that we were a family unit, and we got to know other family units. At that time, families were very tight-knit, and everybody looked out for each other. Nobody was starving, nobody had an upper hand over anybody. We were all equal.
Speaking of families, back in the 50s and 60s, most of the families, regardless if they were Hispanic farm workers or other people, there was a lot of people who, a lot of people lived in small houses. It was common to have a mattress where all the kids slept. And so when people think about that period, most people probably didn't think that they were poor. I think it was just circumstance. Even though we lived in really small houses, a house could have been smaller than 24 feet by 24 feet. But it did have a living room, bedroom, or a living room that served as a bedroom, and then a small kitchen and a small restroom. And so that was sufficient for us. And so growing up, it seemed like when we went north to pick crops, the family kept growing, and over time we started off with just a few children, and as time went on, all my brothers and sisters got to experience the travel and also the harvest of various crops. So we ended up with 10 children in our family, and so they're all very familiar with the trek that we took each year.
Our mothers, Manuel's mother and my mother, they worked side by side with their spouses. And when they went home, there was another job, and that was making dinner. Making dinner for the whole crew. We were 14, Manuel's family was size 10. So you can imagine our mothers being very fatigued to have to feed such a large crowd. And when it came to showering time and all that, we didn't have enough towels. We didn't have enough forks and spoons. I can remember having to wash the spoon so I could use it and pass it along to somebody else. We didn't grow up with luxuries of any kind, but we made do with what we had. We washed our clothes. We were clean. We weren't how some people mistake us as being dirty and not sanitary, and that is untrue. We're very clean people. We bathe every day, we change our clothes every day, but when we go to the store after we've been working in the olives or in the grape vineyards, we are very dirty. Our clothes are dirty and sweat and dirt, and maybe that's why people got that impression about us, but we're very clean people.
Speaking of women and mothers, farm labor, if anyone had to bear the brunt of doing the farm labor, it was the women and the young girls. They were the first ones to wake up. In the mornings they had to make breakfast and also possibly prepare the lunch. The young girls had to dress the young kids. And sometimes one of the younger girls, if you can imagine a 10-year-old babysitting the young babies. So when we got home from picking, here's the whole time that you go work, you work a full day, you come home, and what happens? We take a shower and relax. Mother, she has to wash clothes, and often, using
Washboard.
a washboard and a tub, and then prepare dinner. And after dinner, wash the dishes. After washing the dishes, making sure that the kids were fine and went to bed clean.
The next morning, we would have to get up and help our mothers make the lunch, because if we were out picking tomatoes, we had to make enough tacos for everybody. And tacos are tortilla filled with beans and potatoes and egg, and chorizo, and we would have to fill up our water jug to make sure we had water, and make sure we had packed enough lunch for a breakfast snack about 9 o'clock in the harvest of tomatoes, and then lunchtime at noon. And so therefore we were not gorging our food, we were salivating it, we were enjoying every bite. And one thing about being a female and a teenager and working, there was no porta potties, there was nowhere you could go and do your business, so we have to go and leave the tomato field and go to the next orchard and see if there's some trees or something. And if you can imagine, you are working and you're starting your menstrual cycle, and you know because you're having cramps. So you ask your sister, you kind of bend over and you say, "Hey, can you check me? Make sure I'm not spotting." And then they say, "No, you're not spotting, okay? You're okay." And how do you explain to your dad, "Hey, Dad, you got to go to the store and get us some sanitary napkins. It's a necessity," but our fathers had to understand all that, and because our mothers didn't drive. And of course, my dad was the only one that had a little bit of English to him. When he crossed the border in Texas, he learned how to say these little phrases that got him by. He'd say, "Fill her up," and he'd say, "Ham and eggs." Before I knew what he was saying, he learned English way before I did. And so to communicate, once I started school, and I was 10 years old when I started school, I picked up on the English, and then I became the translator. Everywhere we went, I was the translator, whether we went to the store or out in the grape vineyard or paying bills, whatever it was. That was my role, and that role continued till the day my parents left this earth.
Speaking of family, most of the people our generation, you would think they would have negative thoughts of growing up doing farm labor. But in fact, the reality is that most people our age, at least the people that we know, it's sort of like a badge of honor to have grown up doing that work. In fact, most people have fond memories of growing up with family doing farm labor. When we used to pick olives, usually back when the weather was cool in the fall and it would rain, when we'd return from the grapes, we'd pick olives. And what would happen is that when we picked olives, back in the day, especially in the late 50s, early 60s, they still hadn't started using a lot of herbicides. So the grass was tall, and the only place where the caterpillar would go through and disking would be the drive rows where they'd throw the boxes and pick them up. But what would happen is the mornings in the fall, we would be picking olives all the way into November. And so we would get wet, just above our knees would get wet, and it'd get cold in the mornings. And what was really nice is that my dad would start a fire. He'd go around the orchard looking for dead wood, and he'd make a small fire. And then if it started to burn real quick, he'd send me to go get some dead wood and add to the fire. And after a while, when there was sufficient embers, then my mother would bring out the lunch box and place the tacos on the embers. And what was really amazing is that, in those situations, the air is so pristine and clean. You could smell the tortillas warming up, and these smells of for example, the chorizo tacos. You could smell them up the ladder where we were working. Then she would warm up the canela, which is cinnamon tea, and you could smell that cinnamon tea. Again, it was very volatile. We could smell it, and we got a huge appetite. And eventually, my mother would call us to sit down and have like a brunch, I guess. It's a late breakfast. And so we pull up our boxes and our cans and sit on them, put our feet next to the fire, and she would give us each a taco. And we would actually eat it very, very slow because it was so tasty. When food tastes especially good when you've been working and the weather is not perfect, whether it's very cold or very hot. And we would, like I said, we would get those burritos or tacos and we would bite them very slowly, one small morsel at a time, trying to take our time because we knew that after we finished our food, we'd have to go return back to the harvesting of olives. But being together with brothers and sisters, because all of us would go in the olives, there was a place for the little children to hang out with us. It was very nice. And I think to this day, I think most people who were involved in those kind of things loved being with family, and they are fond of those memories.
All right.
Well, the one thing that probably has evolved, I think that when you speak of young children working in the fields, that pretty much is gone. Children at a very young age, in fact, are discouraged from going to the fields. So when we grew up, for example, most kids did not realize that, when we came back to school and we got asked, what did you do for summer vacation? We would say that we went camping. But their interpretation of camping was quite different from us. Their camping was like going to Sequoia National Park or going someplace that's really nice and camping out. However, for us, it meant that we were putting up a tent, making a little house out of boxes and living in that, and then moving from one place to the next. Now, the one thing that I think is quite different is that in today's world, most young people are discouraged from working. In fact, in the gardens that we work at today, most children do not know how to work, and these are high school students. They don't know about hard work. They don't know about taking responsibility. So some of the things that we try to do here is to teach them how to work and how to get along with everybody they meet. But as this whole thing about, we talked about some of the nice things with family, but it was very common. In the old days, we worked directly with farmers. And of course, some of the farmers were very nice to us. But amongst those farmers that we worked for, there was also those people who we had bad experiences with. I recall one time that one farmer was actually picking on a family that was next to us. And so that made us very uncomfortable and unhappy. And so when he crossed over, this is a tall farmer and the vines are very short. He stepped over the vines and came over to our row. And he was already in a bad mood. And so we've been speaking about our experiences growing up in the orchards and the tomato fields of Central California. But also, things were not that rosy all the time. We worked for farmers at that time. There were very few farm labor contractors, so we always would look for people that we knew, usually foremen that were hiring crews. And if we were in San Jose, we'd always go to the green trailer, which was the EBD trailer, to find jobs, directly with farmers. Now, when we worked with these farmers, some of them were very kind to us and treated us good. In fact, they would even, one farmer in Hollister would buy us, at the break time, would bring us cold sodas and cold water to drink. However, there were those individuals who were not kind, who were, in fact, rude. In one particular case, when Olga and I were just married, there was a farmer who was cussing out and yelling at a family next to our row, and this is in the grape harvest. And so we really felt bad that he was doing that. And then suddenly he decided to come to our row. And so what he did is that the vines were kind of short, and he was a tall guy, probably over 6 foot tall. And the first thing he did was he began to yell at us and cuss at us. And in his language, he looked at me and he said, "Hey, you," he says, there were some grapes that fell out of the pan as I was dumping, and I hadn't seen them. And he says, "Hey, you," he says, pickle the bunchos, pickle the bunchos." And I looked at him and I say, "Look, this is the way you were talking to the people next door. That's not acceptable." He says, "Back in the days of slavery and all that, you were free to do that, but today you can't do that. You have to respect your workers and you have to treat them right." And the first thing he said was, "You're fired." And so I just made it up, but I said, "You cannot fire us." He said, "If you want us to leave, you have to go back home, you get a check, or you can get a check out of your wallet and pay us right now, and then we'll leave." So he was upset. He took off, and a little while later, he did show up with a check, and so we left. But that was the only experience. Over time, we did meet people who were not, farmers back then. They were very independent, and they, farmed and dealt with people in their own ways. If the guy was obnoxious and loud, he was obnoxious and loud all the time. If they were kind people, they were always kind. One thing that I learned over time was that when I was growing up as a kid, I thought everybody was nice, especially adults. But I learned that people who were, what's the right word? The people who were assholes when they were young, they were assholes when they were old. And so it was good to learn that people reflect, their personalities. And so, we went through those experiences with good farmers, and we went through those experiences with the bad ones.
Like I said, since I was the translator for my family, we had an experience. We left California, and we passed Oregon and went straight into Washington. And we were picking strawberries. Well, it started to rain, and we were out there in the rain, and my dad and my mom said, "Let's leave," because we're used to working in California where if it rains, you get back in the car or you go home. So this farmer, he said, "Where are you going? What are you doing?" And I told him, "Well, we're going because it's raining." And I noticed that the other people didn't get up to leave. We were all stooped over picking strawberries. And he says, "You can't leave." And I said, "Well, my father says that we haven't earned enough money to pay you back," because he had come to Woodlake, showed my parents and other people from Woodlake a video how we could go into Washington and make some good money and pick strawberries for him. So he had loaned my father money for gas, and I was not aware that we owed this farmer any money. And he says, "You can't leave." He says, "You haven't paid me back." So I asked my dad, "What do we owe him?" My dad says, "We owe him like $200 for gas." So between my brother and his wife and my family, we rounded up all the money that we had and paid him back. And he was already on his walkie-talkie, and he was addressing his foremen to block our exit. And I was feeling a little bit like, this isn't right. This doesn't feel right. So he says to us, "You can't leave." And he said, "Well, we've already paid you. We can do what we want to do. We're ready to go." And then he says, "Well, I don't know where you people come from." And I told him, "Well, we come from California." I said, "What you're used to is Mexican braceros, and you're used to treating them the way you want to treat them, and disrespect." And I said, "We're Mexicans from California. We are not treated this way." I said to him. So we're leaving. and we left. And I was so proud of myself. I didn't have time to translate to my dad what I had said, but I think he understood.
Well, as the farm labor force evolved, naturally, up until about the early 60s, the bracero program was still intact. And we used to actually see the crews of braceros. In fact, my dad, he went and stole two of my uncles from the bracero crews in Fresno and brought them to work with us. But, the bracero program ended. There was a few crews. It's interesting to me because when we were kids, there were actually crews of white people working next to our crew, and there were crews in Fresno of black grape pickers, which is really interesting. But over the years, that diminished. We never saw those crews later. But there was no braceros, there was no white crews, there was no black crews out there picking grapes. And then, as time went on, we began to see more and more farm labor contractors. And the contractors, they had to abide more by the regulations, and so I think part of what was happening is that the farmers didn't want to deal directly with the farm workers, and plus the uncertainty of having that access to labor. And of course, the farm labor contractors had good contact with farm workers and farm worker families, so they're able to hire groups of people and keep them employed for most of the year. So good contractors who had work all year round were the ones that are able to organize crews and maintain them for longer periods of time, and so they were the most successful ones.
I have one thought as a follow-up, and maybe this is I don't know if this is a way of putting things in perspective or context or conclusion here, but if we look at things that are needing improvement in the whole food production system and everything, and again, that red book there, that paints a very unfair, and you talked about they have some berry farmers up in Washington State that are Japanese and everything, and there's this racist kind of like caste system that is described in there. All right, but and that's fairly recent. That's only 5 years old there. But from your perspective now, and let me put both of you on the spot here, what improvements are needed in the food system with respect to the farm labor component or farm worker component? Think about that. I mean, your own growing up experiences are wonderful and rich and based in family and all the good relationships and everything and good memories. But where is work still need to be done in terms of farm labor? I don't know if that's a fair question.
Oh yeah.
Because I want to get. But then, what does that mean to you guys? Go ahead there. I'll be quiet. All right, go ahead.
So as the farm labor opportunities continued, they were mostly through farm labor contractors. And what happened to us in the 50s and 60s was that those few growers who were very rude and who sometimes would cheat the farm workers of their salaries, complete salaries, people are not going to work for them. And so they've been thinned out through just, as an example, today they've always talked about a shortage of farm labor. But I think today, there's truly the possibility of a labor shortage when it comes to immigrant workers. And so you can't be a unlawful employer. And so now that's actually minimized. So almost all farm labor is farm labor contractors. But there are still things that need to be improved. And I think that, as an industry, instead of, quite often the industry, especially the large farmers, they're funding legislators who affect the laws and regulations that impact workers, including minimum wage. And I think, to be able to have a living wage for farm labor in California, that the ag industry, they have to be leaders and lead the charge to try to give these people, people like us, give them a living wage so that they can afford to live in their communities. And if you were to give them a 50% wage increase, that would not necessarily raise the price of food that much when you consider all the inputs to food. And so instead of fighting farm workers, they should look into novel ways where they could increase the benefits and the wages of farm workers without raising the price of food. One thing might be through the legislation would be a surcharge on food so that it actually goes directly to farm workers. As an example, I'll take a crop. Let's say it's citrus. When people buy citrus and they sell it by the pound, they could add a surcharge of 3 cents or 2 cents a pound that would actually go to fund either the benefits or the wages of the farm workers. So, farmers need to be leaders in trying to develop an industry that's sustainable. If you provide good salaries and good benefits, you're going to have a workforce regardless, because I can imagine, not all farm laborers working in the heat. People work in packing houses, they work in other allied industries, and there's ways that can be developed to help farm workers and help the industry.
All right.
There's one subject that I wanted to bring up, and that is the heat wave that we are experiencing. It is not only in California, it's throughout the Southwest, and I have a feeling that it's going to continue, and it's going to affect the farm workers that are out there in the exposure to the sun. And everything's a chain reaction in life, and I feel like it's going to affect the food on the table, the food at the grocery store, because I think that legislation should go into effect as to protecting them from this exposure. What time they should start work, what time they should quit working for their own safety. And in reality, without the farm workers, there is no food on the table.
Yeah.
And I've been concerned about water shortage, and I've been concerned about the heat wave and its impact on all of us. And I just wanted to mention that.
Well, Jeff, you asked about the Woodlake Botanical Garden. Olga and I, it's been probably more than 30 years ago, we were wondering what we could do for our community. In fact, when we first got married, we wanted to do something for our community. And so what we decided to do, number one, was to create something that would be a positive thing for the community. So at that time, we actually worked on local public areas and tried to beautify them. In fact, we got this old bar that had graffiti on it, and we asked the owner if we could paint a mural on it. And so that's exactly what we did. We got a bunch of kids from the community, and we went and painted this mural downtown. And what happened is that instead of people saying it was a great idea, they actually sent police out, and they had us. And eventually they gave us a cease and desist order to stop painting the mural. To make a long story short, we got lawyers, and so we were able to win that decision on the mural. But then, Olga thought, maybe we should do something else besides the murals, and so with kids in the community, and we did. So soon after that, we started working with kids in gardens in town. So for about a decade, we had gardens over the entire community. We had gardens in every part of town, and we had kids that would help us plant those gardens. And they were mostly young children. They were from the ages of 5 to maybe 12 years old. And so doing that over the years, we got to be friends with the planner for Woodlake. And one day he told us that the the Southern Pacific Railroad was selling the railroad right-of-way that ran right through town. And so he applied for a Rails to Trails grant, and they purchased the land with that Rails to Trails money. And then additionally, Mr. Collins, he applied for a small grant to put in some water, connect water to the garden from the city. And so from that point on, the garden is 1 mile long. Even though it's a very long trail, it's only 14 acres. But we told the council that if they would give us the land, that we would plant gardens. And so we relied heavily on the goodwill of the ag industry to provide plant material and seeds to plant in the gardens. And so we proceeded to do that, one garden at a time. Olga, I just retired about 9 years ago, but Olga, over that period, worked with kids through the summer every day. And from putting in water lines to planting trees and shrubs, Olga did everything with the kids. And I would help them on, after work and also on weekends. So it was really nice when I retired to be able to be with our volunteers on a daily basis. But this garden was established, actually we got the property in 2003, and so in early 2004 we started planting the gardens. And it's just been, for us and our volunteers, it's been a labor of love to establish this facility. And now I would say that if you come in spring, it is actually one of the most beautiful locations that you can come to in Central California.